Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's almost 2 o'clock, so we'll ease into this as people continue to arrive, but there are about 61 folks online, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to all of you for joining us today on Juneteenth. This is a webinar versus a meeting, so everyone is automatically muted and their cameras are not on, so the only two people you'll see during the webinar today are Andrew and myself. So before we do introductions, I did just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone is muted and we won't be taking questions in an open forum. Feel free to use the chat box or the question function in the webinar, which each of you should be able to see in your menu bar. You can submit a question, and Andrew and I will keep an eye on those throughout the webinar, and we have a colleague who's also helping us to monitor them, so we may not get to all of them, but we will try to address them as they arise. We also have a poll that we would like you to take after you have dropped in the name of the tribe or tribes whose land you occupy. Since we're virtual, this is our way of doing a land acknowledgement, which is how we like to begin all of our meetings, to just honor and acknowledge the Native caretakers of the land we occupy. So Andrew and I are based in Washington, D.C. So we occupy the land of the Anacostia and Piscataway. So I will drop into the chat again the website where you can enter your geographic information and find out the name of the tribe or tribes whose land you occupy. And we invite you to drop that information into the chat. Thanks to those of you who are already doing so. We also wanted to acknowledge that today is Juneteenth, and this has been designated for many as a day of learning. So for those of you who are joining us today as part of your learning journey, welcome. But on June 19th, 1865, in Galveston, Texas, more than 250,000 remaining enslaved African Americans were informed that they had been emancipated 2 years prior. So this day is celebrated as the end of slavery, not the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation, but the date on which all enslaved individuals in the country at that time were made aware that they were free. And so for some, it's a day of celebration. For others, it's a day of reflection. And having this webinar today was our way of acknowledging Juneteenth, as well as acknowledging the very unique moment that we are in the United States. Hence the title of the webinar, Do Black Lives Matter in Your Organization? Living into the Values of Your BLM Statement. There have been thousands of statements released in the past 14 days, and we've gotten a lot of questions from stakeholders and questions about how to move beyond the words in those statements. And so that's what we're going to spend the next hour talking about. I would like to introduce my esteemed co-panelist, Andrew Plumley. I apologize for the typo in your name, Andrew. So I'll let you introduce.
I like that a little bit better anyway. Plumsley is good. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Andrew Plumley. I'm the Director of Inclusion at the American Alliance of Museums, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, the Association for American Museums, from the National Museum of African American History and Culture all the way down to the San Diego Zoo, and kind of everything in between. So it's good to be with you all today. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Andrew. And when I was looking at your name on the slide earlier, something seemed off, but I didn't get it until just now, so I'm sorry. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kirian Suarez, Executive Director of Equity in the Center, and it's a pleasure to be here. Before Andrew was at the American Alliance of Museums, he was part of Equity in the Center, so it's appropriate that we too are part of this discussion today, and it's always a pleasure to work with him. Just quickly, a little note on Equity in the Center. We took a look at the registrant list, and there are some names we recognize, folks who have attended our sessions in the past or used our resources. So welcome to those friends of ours, and welcome to new colleagues. So Equity in the Center has been around publicly since 2017. we were created as a collaborative initiative that initially focused on the lack of diversity at the highest levels of the social sector. And over time, once we examined the issues facing organizations in terms of the lack of diversity, we shifted our focus to be on structural racism in the social sector. And we did our research on how to build a race equity culture and published it as a tool, a resource for organizations to mitigate race-based disparities in their organizational culture, and to mitigate racism and race-based disparities in society broadly. Like, our vision is that organizations will shift their culture and that the compound effect over time would be a shift in American society more broadly. I'll also note that Race to Lead, or the Building Movement Project, just released an update to its Race to Lead report, which talks about the lack of diversity in the social sector. And that was a foundational piece of data for us when it was initially published a couple of years ago. And we'd offer that as a resource, and we'll include it when we send the follow-up materials after today's webinar. So I included this Twitter post because it really captures the reason why we're gathered here today to chat. As I said, thousands of organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, schools, entities of all sorts have released statements in support of Black lives since the murder of George Floyd. And many of those statements included the words Black Lives Matter, which is in and of itself historic, that so many white-led, predominantly white, quote unquote, mainstream corporations and nonprofit and philanthropic entities would say those words publicly, would say Black Lives Matter, would say Black, would name race, which is something as Americans we're socialized generally not to do. But the tension that has arisen with the release of these statements, in addition to the civil rights protests and just the tension that exists in our country generally at this moment, is within organizations, Black employees, as well as employees of color generally, are disappointed and have expressed some strong feelings about the fact that their organizations publish words that they don't say inside of the organization every day, and claim to value Black lives and be about the mitigation of racism in society more broadly, and named that Black lives should be valued equally to white lives, but currently are not in American society. Many staff, Black staff and staff of color, have pointed out to their employers that Black lives are not valued equally inside of their organization every day. And so that's the framing for today's conversation. You may have issued a statement saying that Black lives matter or that it's important to value all life equally, but are you actually living into those values every day inside of your organization? And so this tweet captures the tension between what organizations are saying about themselves and really an aspirational set of values they've put out into the world, and the moment they're in where organizations, for-profits and nonprofits, have to reckon with the fact that they don't value Black life inside of their organization every day. So as I said, Equity in the Center published a body of work, Awake to Woke, Building a Race Equity Culture. So what we're going to do as we go through the webinar is share some of the recommendations and findings from the research, which we hope many of you will use to shift the culture of your organizations toward race equity. But we wanted to begin just by grounding the conversation in some definitions, and I'm not going to read these. But racism involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through institutional policies and practice. And then there are a few shorter definitions. And it's important to ground in that because we are all part of a system of structural racism, and our institutions, our companies, our nonprofits, our foundations uphold that system. So just wanted to ground ourselves in that definition. And I also wanted to name anti-racism because if an organization has promoted that Black Lives Matter and named that racism is wrong and used the word anti-racism, which many organizations did, it's important to actually understand what that word means and then also to develop an understanding of what it looks like in terms of the actions and the choices that you make inside of your organization every day. So anti-racism is the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, societal, and economic life. It's individual, but it's also something that can be done collectively to make progress toward broader shifts in society. And I think this is a really excellent graphic that illustrates a pathway to becoming anti-racist. It's not a roadmap necessarily. It's certainly not a checklist, because this isn't the type of work for which one would work through a checklist. It's not linear. But this does a really good job of illustrating the path we should seek if we are trying to live into values of anti-racism that we've publicly promoted. And so the average American is in the fear zone on this graphic. They don't necessarily recognize that racism is still a problem. Many people believe that we were post-racial following the election of Obama. But what you see as you move to the right of the slide is in the learning zone, which is where a large portion of the country and many organizations are right now, is recognizing that racism is a present and current problem. I will note that people of color, particularly Black people, have lived this reality every day. And so I know that I and Andrew and other colleagues of mine are managing the tension between that lived experience and having, at this point, thousands of white leaders and white-led or predominantly white organizations come to us as if this is a new challenge, when it's not. What we're trying to work through is a moment that has unfolded over 5 centuries. And so it's not realistic or logical to think that there's going to be a 90-day plan or a checklist or a set of steps we can do to undo racism. So I shared this graphic because I think it provides a roadmap. It also outlines some activities that you as individuals, as well as your teams and whole organizations, should be looking to embody in order to live into the values that you tweeted about. So looking in the growth zone, leaders and organizations would identify and name and talk about how they unknowingly benefit from racism, promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist, and sit with discomfort. And I think that's a good characterization of where we are not now. Even if as individuals and organizations we're not in the growth zone, we're sitting in a period of extreme and intense discomfort. And so we hope that some of what we'll talk about in terms of building a race equity culture will be helpful to you in navigating through that moment. We also wanted to touch base on these definitions, in particular anti-Blackness, because in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, the term has been used a lot. And we've also talked about race and racism, and many folks have pushed for the explicit naming of anti-Blackness within a broader system of structural racism. And anti-Blackness voids Blackness of value and voids Black people of humanity. And so when you look at the video of the police officer with his leg on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he obviously didn't feel that the person beneath his leg had any human value. And what Black people in America experience on a daily basis is anti-Blackness in the pyramid of human value, which is something that was created back in the 1700s in connection with Carl Linnaeus's work on the categorization of animals. He further categorized human animals, and Blumenbach built on that by creating a pyramid of humans, which placed Black humans at the bottom and white humans at the top. And so Blackness is positioned in our society and articulated and talked about in imagery and popular culture as the opposite of whiteness. And our value is the least within this system of white supremacy and in this pyramid of human value. So we just wanted to name that because anti-Blackness is alive and well in your organization, whether or not you have ever talked about it. And that is what many staff and colleagues and stakeholders are responding to when they read a statement that's been posted, but having worked in your organization and been part of your team, or seen the way that Black leaders are treated, or the lack of diversity in your organization, or the appropriation of intellectual property, or the silencing of voices inside of your organization, that's the anti-Blackness that they observe and experience. And there's a tension between that and what was in organization's public statement on average. The other definition we wanted to highlight is white supremacy, because we'll name it as we talk about the race equity cycle. Just to put a definition up here, white supremacy is not about the KKK. Those are white supremacists. White supremacy is the ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of people of color. And that, again, ties to the pyramid of human value that I mentioned. So these are a couple of quotes that kind of characterize where we are in America. And these are both current statements. So anti-Blackness indexes the structural reality so that in a larger society, Blackness is inextricably tied to slaveness. And I think it's appropriate that we remember this on Juneteenth, because though you may not have had an explicit conversation about this in your organization to date, this dynamic plays out in how we live and work with one another and how Black people are treated, not just in society, but inside of organizations every day. So I had a conversation recently with an organization that did not have any Black professional staff, but they had a Black administrative assistant. And so what I pointed out is that if you take the organizational chart of many organizations, for-profit, philanthropic, nonprofit, and you overlay their org chart on the pyramid of human value, you will find the Black people in the same place, which is at the bottom. Though there may be some token individuals higher, and certainly there are Black-led organizations which are predominantly white or predominantly or all people of color, and white dominant culture and white supremacy still play out in those spaces. But on average, if you look at white-led, white dominant organizations, there is a hierarchy of people of color within the organization. And that goes to how the pyramid of human value elevates some people of color over Black people, because you may not be white, but at least you're not Black. And that dynamic plays out in the words that are chosen inside of organizations to speak to staff of color, about staff of color, the opportunities that they are given or not given. And the second quote comes from a Mississippi legislator who on the 16th framed African Americans as dependent because of our history of enslavement in this country. And I included this because often white colleagues, when we talk about race, will reference how far in the past slavery is. You know, that was centuries ago. But African Americans were enslaved for 2.5 centuries, and even more than that if you look at what happened after the 13th Amendment. But slavery and the legacy of slavery and the connection of Black skin to slavery is present in American society every day. I can see it in the way that I'm treated as a Black woman. I can see it in the way that Black men are treated in broader society. And you can certainly see it in the murder of George Floyd and other Black men and Black women in this country. So we just wanted to use this as a touch point and an illustration.
Okay.
Andrew?
Okay, can I just give a couple more kind of words that go to the anti-Blackness conversation? I think when we think about anti-Blackness and we think about the hierarchy of human value in the white body and the Black body, I think some things that have helped me kind of frame this out and think about is that the white body is really looked at something to be protected. There's an innocence to it. There's a safety to it, versus the Black body. What that is, it's in people's minds, it's something to be feared. It's something that's unintelligent. It's something that needs some sort of dependence, like Kay was saying. So those words are wrapped up in our understanding of what a white body and a Black body are.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to advance the slide. I'm answering one question because apparently there's a problem with the poll, which we edited right before we began, and I think it suppressed the option to identify as white. So I apologize, and that was not intentional. So I wanted to just touch base on a couple of statements before Andrew transitions to talk about building a race equity culture. Like I said, there have been thousands of statements, but there were some statements that were better than others in that they named the complicity of the institution in white supremacy, their role in institutional racism, and they took accountability for the way that racism and anti-Blackness has shown up inside of their organization. So I just offer the Epicurious statement. It's part of the Condé Nast family of media outlets. And I highlighted some of the words that were particularly important because some folks made statements about Black Lives Matter, but fewer organizations named their complicity and named how racism played out in their internal culture and practice. And so this statement is one I just wanted to highlight as one that begins the process of taking accountability for the way anti-Blackness and racism manifests on a daily basis. Because the co-option, the appropriation, the Columbusing of not just Black ideas and intellectual property, but that of people of color generally, is a standard part of doing business, not just in the for-profit sector, but in the nonprofit sector. And it's important to name. And they also named how Black staffers had been tokenized in their organization as part of their culture. And that's something that is not unique to Epicurious. The other statement I wanted to include as a point of reference comes from the Stonewall Community Foundation. And I chose Epicurious versus Stonewall because Epicurious named that it had a lot of work to do. I didn't include the full statement. Stonewall is an organization that has been living into a race equity culture, and they published a very explicit statement on the value of Black life. And I highlighted the text, fall back and let Black people lead, invest in Black-led organizations and campaigns and ideas, identify and interrupt microaggressions, acknowledge your own anti-Blackness. And so I think part of this conversation today is encouraging folks to begin a conversation about anti-Blackness, institutional racism inside of their organizations. Because whether or not you're aware that anti-Blackness lives and breathes inside of your organization or that racism lives and breathes inside of your organization, the people of color inside of your organization and the Black people inside of your organization are well aware that it does. And we're treated as such on a daily basis. Andrew, you want to transition?
That's right, thanks. And so thanks, Kate, for kind of framing up, where we are and what we've been seeing. So I think before we get into the race equity cycle and the research that Equity in the Center has done, we do want to go over just a few more definitions because as Kay mentioned earlier, and as we know, for as many people are on this webinar, for as many people that are kind of in conversation around race equity, there are oftentimes that many different definitions. When we're talking about diversity, inclusion, equity, race equity, we want to make sure that we're on the same page about what those terms actually mean. And so before I get into the cycle, these are some of the three terms that you see here are going to be some of the terms that I mentioned when we go through that race equity cycle. And so I'm not going to read the definitions outright, but I'll say here that race equity, how Equity in the Center means it and defines it, is really when you are if you were to disaggregate all kind of social outcomes or social indicators, housing, income, healthcare, policing, et cetera, if you were to disaggregate that data by race, there would be no difference between white folks and Black folks in that. And we're very far from race equity in society. We're very far from race equity within our companies and organizations. And we always say, it's taken 450 years to get here. And if we knew what equity really looked like, we would just do that. But we've actually never seen equity in the American context. A race equity lens is really thinking about when your organization makes any sort of decision. When you're making a decision about who to hire, when you're making a decision about who to invest in or what to invest in, if you're looking at specific partnerships, you would be looking at that with the race equity lens if you were looking at that decision and the disparate outcomes and the disparate impact that would make on people of color. And so there are many tools that you can use to really think about how to use a race equity lens. Some of them you might have heard of, like a race equity impact assessment, but we'll send some links around what those look like. But that's really what a race equity lens is. And then the last definition is, I believe it's race equity culture, which is really a culture that's proactively counteracting social and race inequities, both externally of the organization and internally in the organization. And you'll see a little bit more about what that means ahead. Great. So this is the race equity cycle, and this is really the research that Equity in the Center um, has done. And this really is showing how organizations over time have measurably shifted their culture from one that's really focused on a white supremacy culture to one that focuses on race equity. And so it's also it's a reframing of what is often called DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what we heard while we were doing the research around the race equity cycle is that these terms have really gotten muddled up with each other, and oftentimes people don't know what you're talking about. So often we'll hear someone say, we're doing diversity work, and they really mean equity work or vice versa. And so we wanted to reframe the DEI conversation to awake, woke, and work. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm just gonna make sure. Can you hear me all right? Still okay?
Yeah, we can't hear the feedback.
Oh, okay, so it's just me. Okay. And so that's the reframing that we decided to do. And so I'm gonna go just through this a little bit so you get a clear picture of what each stage really looks like. So in the awake stage, which is really the reframing of diversity, organizations are really focused on representation. It's really the transactional ways that diversity comes into organizations. It's a check the box stage in many ways. And so another way that I like to think about this is it's really kind of the people type strategies that you're talking about. It's really a pipeline issue about like trying to get Black and brown faces into an organization. And so, right, we're not really worried about at this point in the awake stage how people are actually interacting with each other within the organization. It's really about checking those boxes. In the woke stage, this is really where this is the reframing of inclusion. And this is where we're really trying to start to build a culture that allows people to bring their full selves to work. It allows for different ways of knowing and being within an organization, different ways of communicating. And so just like in the awake stage, you can think about it as counting the people. In the woke stage, it's very much trying to make sure that people are counted in how they bring themselves to that work. And then in the work stage, it's really about addressing the racial kind of inequities and the systemic inequities both within the organization, and you have the kind of tools and analysis to know where you're perpetuating white supremacy culture, both inside the organization and externally outside of the organization. And so those are the three stages. And I want to say a couple things about how that actually works. Actually, there's another stage that's a pre-awake stage, or sometimes the asleep stage, depending on where you are. There are many organizations that are not talking about this at all. They're either willfully ignorant of what's happening, or they know it's happening and they don't want to talk about it. So there is that asleep stage. In many of these stages, it takes 3 to 5 years to move, upwards of 10 years for some. The awake stage, I would say 75% of the organizations that we work with are in the awake stage. And the woke stage is really a time where there is that's a really hard stage to get to, and that's where a lot of the culture change happens. And in that time, one thing that often happens is that a lot of people leave. Many organizations that are starting the work will start to hire diverse representation and get to and be a much more, diverse organization. But when they start doing the inclusion work, a lot of people will say, I didn't really sign up for this work, or this is too uncomfortable for me. And people will start to leave, and that's a part of this work, and I want to name that because it's a difficult thing that organizations do go through. And as I said, it takes about 3 to 5 years to move from one stage to the next, and you'll see that there are 7 levers that kind of help seven management levers that organizations can use to activate to go through this cycle. But I just want to pause and see if Kay has any additions around the stages, the time frame of these things before we go into one of the organizational levers. Oh, you're on mute.
Just trying to help with feedback. I think you covered everything. I think the one example I often give is just using myself as an example of white dominant culture and what it means inside of an organization. That's one definition we didn't share because we couldn't fit everything. But white dominant culture is sort of the standard setting in American society. It's how we do things. I think I mentioned earlier that if we were giving interview advice to someone, to a child, to a mentee, there's a certain way that you would recommend that they show up at that interview in order to get the job, a way to speak, to present themselves. And that way of being and doing broadly aligns to white dominant culture. And often when you look at organizations, whether they're predominantly white organizations or organizations of color, the people with greater power, the people of color with greater seniority within the organization's power structure are more closely aligned to white dominant standards of education, career paths, often even speaking, and how they present themselves. And the example that I give is the difference in how folks of color, and I can use my own community, Black people who are employed in an organization, whether it's for-profit or philanthropic or nonprofit, the differences in how those individuals show up, so where they went to school, how they speak, how they dress, how they present themselves, often even where they live, or if they went to school, depending on whether they are an administrator at that organization or whether they are a VP or a director or some senior member of the board, for example. And anti-Blackness is infused in that disparity in Black people's experience and ability to ascend within a power structure that values white dominant attributes. And when I said to my former employer that I was the whitest person that they could find for the job, it wasn't because I look white. It's because if you look at my resume, you can't tell that I am not white. And the way that I speak and where I went to school makes people think that I will, quote, fit in a predominantly white environment. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kay. Yeah, that's a helpful. And Kay, can you go on mute? So, because I do hear that gurgling a little bit. Thank you. And yeah, someone said in the chat, it's a good visual tool and it's really a continuum. And it's interesting that you say that because one of the things that when we were doing the research, we kept hearing, we actually started with it going from awake to woke to work, from left to right. And everyone that we talked to who's a practitioner of this work, they're like, that's really not how this works. It's very nonlinear, and you might be in the awake stage, you might be going into the woke stage, but then something external happens that really shakes things up, and you might move back to the awake stage. So it's nonlinear in that way. And I'll also mention that depending on how your organization is organized, different departments or different kind of silos within your organization might their experiences might be different depending on who they are and what type of work that they do. So I'll give an example of the American Alliance of Museums. So I'm the director of inclusion. My team is all people of color. And so our understanding of the work and our experience within a primarily white organization, we would probably say that the organization is in the awake stage. But for someone that's new to this work, in a different department might say, oh, we're really doing a much better job. We're probably in the woke or work stage, for instance. And so based on kind of the identity that you self-identify as, or the department and the work that you do, you might have a different experience. But ultimately, you're right, it never does end. And it's always working towards being better. So as you saw, there were 7 management levers that organizations we found could use to activate and go through this cycle. It's really clusters of best practices, really. And what we wanted to share with you today was the organizational culture lever. And what we want to show is really how folks move and what it kind of looked like, sounded like, feels like within this lever from awake to woke to work. And so you'll see that there are a set of personal behaviors and beliefs, policies and processes, and data that back up that particular lever and that particular stage. So we wanted to walk through that with you now. So in the awake stage for organizational culture, which is really an umbrella for a lot of the levers here, the organization and its culture like understand that white dominant workplaces and culture actually exists, but they expect people to adhere to that, right? They expect people to adhere to that dominant culture, and that's another way of saying that's really assimilation, right? We're asking folks of color to leave themselves at the door and walk in and perform. And I also have seen this be, you know, it's really, when you think about recruiting for diversity at this point, you're recruiting for difference, but then you're definitely onboarding for similarity, right? So that's really what assimilation is all about within an organization. And the policies and processes, they're sharing the organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in its onboarding process. And then in terms of data in the awake stage, they're increasing diverse staff, and so really focused on kind of pipeline and recruitment, and really not addressing issues tied to retention and why those same folks might be leaving in 6, 8, 10, 12, 18 months. In the woke stage, organizations at this point are really compelled to discuss racially charged events with their staff, but they aren't placing undue responsibility of having that conversation on those same people of color, where they have to really explain or defend their own humanity, or talk about or be the voice for their whole community. And at this point, everyone's expected to participate in all things around race equity across all levels of the organization, from senior leadership all the way down to the most junior level staff person. And they've got a kind of a long-term strategic plan with measurable goals on creating a race equity culture, and the understanding of what needs to take place for them to move from awake to woke. And in terms of all work streams. And then in the work stage, the organization at this point is fostering a positive environment where people can raise race-related concerns around policies and programs without really experiencing what we see all the time around negative consequences, being labeled a troublemaker or too loud, scary, whatever those whistles are. This is one where we see this all the time, and I get calls weekly from professionals who have raised race-related concerns with either HR or have raised race-related concerns with the executive teams, and 2 months, 3 months later, they're gone for some other performance-related issue. This is really one that all people of color have felt and know about, and there's repercussions for bringing up race and conversations around that in predominantly white spaces. And so this, at the work stage, that would not happen, and there would be a process and a container to have conversations in real time. They'd be threading accountability across all efforts to support and sustain racially equitable organizations. And then they would be assessing all of the achievements that they made around social inclusion through employee engagement surveys. One thing about the employee engagement surveys, it's crucial that you do employee engagement surveys to really get a pulse of where your organization is and the people and what people are feeling inside the organization. One thing that I'll say about that, though, is that for most organizations, when you do the engagement surveys, at first you might say, well, we're going to share all this information out. We need to be transparent. Often you get a lot of feedback that's hard to hear, especially if you're an executive or you're in a leadership position. And so definitely working through how you're going to share that information is going to be crucial, but also as leaders or as people that are going to be a part of seeing the results, just be prepared for anything that you might get, because if people are honest about that, especially from people of color, it can be a jarring experience, but something that you need to know about and address. Great. So one question that we get a lot after doing this, the kind of race equity cycle conversation is, this is great, but like, what do we actually do? How do we get started? And so we wanted to give some examples of what to do. And so here are some. And Kay, hop in with anything that you think makes sense as well. But the first one, have open and continuous dialogue about race equity at work. We can't get to creating a race equity culture if we don't have conversations around race. And we can't make statements around Black Lives Matter if we can't have conversations about how they actually don't within your organization. But those conversations do have to be facilitated, I would say, with external facilitation as often as possible, especially if you're just starting this work. And I would also say that don't have the conversation if you're willing to listen. If you're not willing to listen, especially at the senior leadership level, it's not going to do any good. The second one is establish a shared vocabulary. We were trying to model that earlier. This is a really important one. Making sure that everyone in your organization knows what terms they're using and how they're using them. So again, everyone has a different definition for diversity, inclusion, and equity. We definitely recommend, we've worked with many organizations that have actually created their own glossary of terms and use that to help in understanding of things like diversity, equity, inclusion, intersectionality, white supremacy culture, etc. One thing that we've seen work really well is finding executives and finding board members who are going to be those race equity champions. Those folks that are really going to bring up things tied to race in every conversation. If you can give them the support that they need to have those conversations, they can help build momentum around building a race equity culture. The fourth thing that's super important is naming race equity as a strategic imperative for your organization and tying your understanding of race equity to the achievement of your mission and your goals. If you can tie race equity to what you're actually doing and the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve, that will help in operationalizing equity and embedding it into everything that you do. And then the fifth bullet here is disaggregation of data. You're not going to be able to know anything about race equity culture if you don't disaggregate data by race. And remember, our definition of race equity is really an outcome. It's about closing gaps between different people. And so if you don't disaggregate data by race, you're not going to have a baseline level of understanding of what those actual gaps are. So equity is really about closing that gap so that there's no difference between race. And Kay, I'll hand it back off to you. Oh, questions.
Of course, I'm talking with the mute on, so apologies. Thanks so much, Andrew. I've been trying to answer the questions that folks have raised as you were talking, so apologies for the typos in the answers that I have submitted. One question I did want to highlight ties to where you landed, Andrew, with the last recommendation on how to move forward, which is to disaggregate the data. Someone submitted a question that said, if your work is actually supposed to focus on supporting communities of color in better serving and achieving better outcomes for communities of color? How do you get them to center equity in their work? One of the short answers to that would be to focus on the data, though I'm not completely sure I interpreted the question correctly, but it would be to follow the data. So if, for example, you have a white-led or a POC organization that is providing services or programs to communities of color, and they don't feel that quote unquote equity should be an explicit part of their work, which is an extremely common belief, despite the presence of the word equity in that same organizations or those same organizations' handbooks and websites and materials, is to follow the data. So when you disaggregate data, race is the biggest driver of disparities in society and generally inside of organizations as well. And so the Race to Lead report that I mentioned at the outset is a great illustrator of that inside of nonprofit organizations. So if you were talking to an organization's board, and this is a common conversation and a regular one that Andrew and I and our colleagues have, if you're talking to a board who doesn't think equity has anything to do with their mission to serve Latinx communities or their mission to serve underserved or marginalized, and I'm putting these words in quotation marks because they're not asset-based and they frame the community as having deficits, they don't get the point. What does equity have to do with serving Black and brown communities? So start with the data. If you disaggregate the data in society broadly, and if you disaggregate the data in communities, race is the biggest driver of disparities in health outcomes, educational outcomes, and the list goes on. So the data would lead you to focus on race because race is driving disparities. Often the folks who make these statements are the least proximate to issues of inequity. So board members, for example, or senior executives, for example. There's also this broader spirit of charity and colonization that can be tied to many organizations' history and desire to remain in certain communities. So another thing that has to be reckoned with as you work to build a race equity culture and discuss anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity also, is to name the colonial dynamic at play in quote unquote charitable institutions where predominantly white groups bring resources in to help save a community. So all of those things are bound up often in the pushback that equity doesn't have anything to do with our mission to serve, quote, underserved populations. Another question that was raised is, does the race of a facilitator you bring in to lead a conversation matter? And the answer is yes, but it depends on the particular situation. So the race of a facilitator is going to mediate or moderate a discussion of race because their identity is real. And that's, proof that our identities matter. So, we live in this, what people will sometimes call a colorblind society. But our racial identity doesn't matter to our experience of the world, number one, outside of work, at work. It also is material to how people perceive us. So that's the reason why I got negatively reviewed for being, I think, aggressive and strident in my management of others when those same characteristics were considered leadership in a white man. So if you are having a training on anti-Blackness for an organization of all white people, or mostly white people, I would encourage you to have a transparent conversation with the facilitators you're interviewing about how their identity factors into their work, because each of them should have an excellent and well-articulated answer for you that talks about their own journey to doing this work, their experience and their identity, and how they think it manifests in their work. And if you are doing work on white privilege or anti-Blackness or building a race equity culture with a group of all white people, it is sometimes most advantageous in terms of having the messages that are going to be sent land with the people to have a white facilitator. And there are white facilitators who specialize in doing anti-racist work and inclusion and equity work with white people. And overall, it's the responsibility of white people to dismantle white supremacy because the system preferences them. So I would encourage you to reach out to folks like that. But you could also have an all-staff training, for example, on any topic that we talked about today, break people into affinity groups by race. So you could do a white group, you could do Black, Latinx, basically as many identities as possible, because people of color are not a monolith. Black people alone, the diaspora of Blackness, the diaspora of indigeneity, and the Latinx community is broad. So it would be helpful to provide people with space to talk about their particular experience. But even if you can't, if you had a group of employees of color and then you had staff who identify as white, you could have facilitators for those two groups who share that identity. So I'll stop there. We talk a little bit about it in a blog we published called So You Want to Hire an Equity Consultant? And one of the webinars that we're going to do in the upcoming weeks focuses on that. So we'll come back to that topic at a later time.
Okay, one question that was popped up in the chat too is around kind of the global perspective. If you have a global team, how do you start conversations around this when the context is so different, the American context versus something maybe in Latin America, and your perspective on that?
Okay, hold on. Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to. Okay, someone asked for the link to the blog post. I'm trying to multitask. The So You Want to Hire an Equity Consultant. We can include it with the recording. So the question is, what if you're doing this work in a global context? So in a country other than the US, or with a team of people from all over the world?
Specifically, Yvette's mentioned kind of creating shared language and not doing harm across the globe. Yeah.
So yes, it's important to name and to manage for in these conversations, because, for example, just like I was saying earlier, you could have a breakout group of people who identify as Black. They won't all be from the same country, and they will have vastly different understandings and experiences of their identity. For example, if a Black person grew in a Black country versus they grew up in the United States. So you would want to have a facilitator who can help craft a discussion that will be as inclusive as possible of the diversity of lived experiences within a global diaspora, whether it's Latinx, white, because white is a diaspora in that there are white people all over the world, indigenous folks. And I'd say a facilitator could work with you to design a meeting and a process for engaging in discussion of equity that meets your team where they are and names the geographic or cultural context in which they as individuals are working, if they're not, for example, American, or if you're in another country, names the colonial context and the racial history of, say, a Brazil or a South Africa. So you can still do it. It's more complex and more nuanced, for sure.
And I'll also just mention, it is definitely much more complex and much more nuanced. I'll also mention that anti-Black racism is a global issue. You often see people with darker skin suffering the most in any context. So I would just say that as something that can anchor the conversation, no matter if you're in the American context or elsewhere.
Yeah, that's important. And colorism is universal. It stretches across countries and cultures, and that has to do with the global influence of Europe through colonization. Within each community of color, there is colorism. And that plays out, as I was mentioning earlier, in terms of grouping BIPOC folks together and saying, okay, well, this is your group. There are hundreds of groups in there. And within each community of color, we have our own issues around internalized racism, and colorism is a manifestation of internalized racism, because in a system that is based in a culture and a society that's based on the hierarchy of human value, people with lighter skin have a perceived physical proximity to whiteness and are therefore treated better, not just by white people, but by their own people. And that whether you're Black, whether you're Latinx, whether you're indigenous, whether you're Asian, whether you're African, whether you're American, we all know this to be true in our families, because we treat one another better when our skin is lighter. And that is something that really has to be named and worked through. And some communities some cultures have a more explicit discussion of colorism than others. So often in our work, Black participants will name this and have a more robust ongoing discussion of colorism in their community. But our Latinx colleagues will often name that it is not spoken in their families. It's not spoken even often in affinity groups of Latinx folks, some of whom are Afro-descended. It varies if you're from an Asian family, whether or not this thing that is spoken. But we are all treated better when our skin is lighter, whether your family wants to talk about it or not. Andrew, anything you want to add?
No, that was well said.
Thanks. Well, we're nearing the end. Are there any last questions folks want to submit? Oh, here's one.
Yeah, here's another here.
All right, someone shared, would welcome any guidance you have for staff to discuss the need for a stronger organizational commitment to or investment in race equity with a white ED CEO who is resistant to the idea that we have not done enough and at times have made problematic remarks that have troubled the rest of the staff. Yes, very real challenge that we hear often, and there's no easy answer. Often we encourage folks to engage co-conspirators and develop a strategy to bring that person along. And that can include a variety of things like sending them articles. If you're a person who has enough power to do so within the organization, providing learning opportunities like a training with People's Institute or Racial Equity Institute so that the full group gets some education on structural, historical, and institutional racism. Often with people of power and privilege, they don't have to participate in such things, even if the opportunities were provided. Board members are a great example of this. So having an intervention by an ally who shares their racial identity and level of positional power can be effective. So identifying allies who believe this is work that the organization should invest in and working with those allies to push the person. That pushing often comes within the context of a relationship. Something we heard early on, not particularly about CEOs, but about board members, and there is an overlap, not completely in the demographic there, but board members who had biracial grandchildren were often great co-conspirators in this process in terms of moving their peers along. So that's something to consider. Andrew, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think the co-conspirator one is good. Trying to get them in spaces where they see people that they respect talking about these issues, somebody that's understood the connection between the work that the organization is doing, a white leader who understands the connection between the work that they're doing and what race equity is. Because often what honestly moves people is saying, oh, well, they're doing this work well, I also want to do this well. And so getting them in spaces like that is really important, but it has to be people that ED or CEO respects.
CEOs also respond to data. And if the CEO isn't willing to invest in this work, you wouldn't likely have had an equity audit. But through a staff engagement survey, for example, if an individual has the positional power to add questions to it, you can allow your employees to self-identify, as well as your board members. Number one, not enough organizations even do that. It's not illegal to ask people to self-identify. It's illegal to make them self-identify. You can ask the question, you can't force people to answer it. But if you don't ask people to self-identify, then you don't even have any data on who's in your organization other than what you're looking at via optics, which incidentally is against the law to comment on. And Andrew and I have both been part of a surprising number of conversations where executives will talk about phenotype based on like what their assessment of an individual's race or ethnicity, and that is completely out of bounds and illegal. So you can add the question to a survey, allow people to self-identify, ask questions about their experiences of inclusion, disaggregate that data, and then present it to the CEO. Because then there's some data on the relative experience of people of color inside your organization, which might demonstrate the issues that you're trying to get them to pay attention to. I see there's another question. It's 2:59.
We can do it. Are you looking in the Q&A?
Yeah, so
Okay.
someone said they had a conversation with a colleague who said they like to see the board have minimum of 50% people of color. And the response was not necessarily 50%, but representative of our society, so 20%. So they felt that that was harmful and they weren't sure how to respond.
Mhm.
Proportional representation is the lowest possible bar. And so we often will be asked, so what should I be going for? Proportional representation, so representation at the level persons of color are in society generally, or in America, or in your community. That's a low bar to set, and we would encourage you to work toward that. I receive the desire not to have a board be half people of color the way it may have landed with you. It probably would have landed that way with me as well. Because it's a microaggression to some extent, depending upon how that conversation played out. But you never want to have too many people of color. That's a whole other conversation. You can't have too many people of color because that shifts the atmosphere and folks aren't uncomfortable with that. So there could have been a lot of reasons that the person said what they said. Not wanting too many people of color may have been one of them, because that's a not uncommon response. But thank you for sharing. And it's 3:00. So Andrew, is there anything you want to share as we close?
No, I just appreciate you all taking the time today. And I hope this was kind of a helpful learning on and reflection around Black Lives Matter, especially at this moment.
Thanks. Thank you all for your honest questions. And we started with a tweet, so we're going to end with a tweet. This is quite powerful. Unlearning white supremacy isn't Instagrammable. It's deeply personal, existential, and difficult work. It often feels horrible. It will make you cry. You might become depressed. It can be very lonely and isolating. It will shatter your ego and your belief system. Do it anyway. Yes. This is hard soul work in some case. It's going against the grain of how we have been socialized as Americans, not to speak about the atrocities of our own country. So we would encourage you to persist. And we'll follow up with some information on additional webinars that we're doing. So thank you for joining us today. Andrew, thank you for joining us on behalf of AM. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
So thank you and have a good weekend.
Take care.